to understand why the United States and Israel would ultimately choose confrontation with Iran, you have to step back far beyond the headlines, beyond the missiles, beyond even the nuclear debate, and look at the psychological architecture of the relationship itself. Because what we're really dealing with here is not just a geopolitical rivalry, but a transformation of identity. Before 1979, Iran under the Shah was one of Washington's closest allies in the Middle East. It was a pillar of American strategy in the region, stable, predictable, and aligned with Western interests. Israel, too, maintained quiet but meaningful ties with Tehran. There was no inherent, inevitable hostility written into the DNA of these relationships. In fact, quite the opposite, which is precisely what makes what happened next so consequential. Everything changes with the Iranian Revolution. Revolutions don't just replace governments, they redefine reality. They redraw the line between friend and enemy, between us and them. And in Iran's case, the revolution was not merely political, it was deeply ideological. Like the new Islamic Republic didn't just reject the Shah, it rejected the entire framework of Western influence that he represented. The United States was no longer a partner, it became the embodiment of external domination, interference, and moral corruption. Israel, in turn, was recast not as a neighboring state, but as an illegitimate extension of that same Western order. This shift is critical because once a conflict becomes ideological, it stops being negotiable in the traditional sense. You can compromise on borders, on trade, even on security arrangements. But how do you compromise on identity? How do you negotiate with a system that defines itself in opposition to your very existence? That's where the language starts to matter. The rhetoric that emerges after 1979, phrases like Great Satan for the United States, aren't just slogans, they're signals. They tell domestic audiences how to interpret the world, and they tell foreign actors that this is not a conventional dispute. It's a moral one, and moral conflicts historically are the hardest to contain because they demand not coexistence, but resolution. From Washington's perspective, Iran becomes unpredictable, even irrational. A regime driven by ideology rather than interests is harder to deter, harder to engage, and ultimately more threatening. For Israel, the stakes are even more existential. When a state questions your legitimacy, not just your policies, but your right to exist, you don't have the luxury of assuming restraint. You plan for worst case scenarios. You act earlier, not later. Now layer onto that the memory of the hostage crisis, the breakdown of diplomatic ties, decades of sanctions, covert operations, and mutual suspicion. What you begin to see is a feedback loop. Each side interprets the other's actions through a lens of distrust, reinforcing its own worldview. Iran sees containment and pressure as proof of Western hostility. The United States and Israel see Iran's defiance as confirmation of its aggressive intent. Over time, this becomes self-fulfilling. And here's where it gets even more complex. This isn't just about states, it's about narratives. Iran's leadership derives legitimacy in part from resisting the United States and Israel. Opposition is not just a policy, it's a source of identity and cohesion. Similarly, in Washington and Tel Aviv, Iran is not just another country, it's a symbol of instability, of proliferation risk, of a challenge to the rules-based order. So both sides become invested in the conflict, not just strategically, cheekily, but psychologically. What that means is that even moments of potential de-escalation are fragile. Like agreements can be signed, back channels can be opened, but the underlying mistrust doesn't disappear. Like it lingers. It shapes how each move is interpreted. It limits how far either side is willing to go in making concessions. So when we look at the eventual decision by the United States and Israel to strike Iran, it's not simply a reaction to a single event or a sudden escalation. It's the culmination of decades of identity-driven conflict, a slow accumulation of grievances, fears, perceptions that made confrontation increasingly thinkable and eventually in the minds of decision makers unavoidable, because at a certain point, when two sides no longer see each other as adversaries, but as fundamental threats to their way of life, the question is no longer whether conflict is justified. The question becomes whether it can be delayed. And that's the deeper lesson here. Wars like this don't begin when the first missile is launched. They begin when understanding collapses, when narratives harden, and when both sides stop seeing the other as something they can live with and start seeing them as something they must overcome. If there's anything to take from this, it's that the most dangerous conflicts in the world are not driven by power alone, but by perception. Change the perception and you change the trajectory. Ignore it, and history tends to repeat itself with consequences that are far harder to control. If the first layer of this conflict is identity, then the second layer, the one that transforms tension into urgency, is the nuclear question, because nuclear weapons change the psychology of decision-making in a way few other factors can. They compress time, amplify fear, and eliminate the margin for error. At the center of this issue sits the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, an agreement that for a brief moment seemed to offer a way out of the cycle of escalation. It wasn't perfect. No agreement like this ever is, but it created something incredibly valuable in geopolitics: predictability. Iran accepted limits on its nuclear program, inspections were put in place, and in return, sanctions were eased for the United States and its European partners. It was a mechanism to delay and monitor Iran's path to a nuclear weapon. For Iran, it was recognition and acknowledgement that it could exist within the international system without surrendering its sovereignty. But here's the problem. Agreements don't exist in a vacuum. They exist within political systems, and those systems change. When the United States withdrew from the deal, it didn't just dismantle a policy, it disrupted a fragile equilibrium. From Iran's perspective, it confirmed a long-standing suspicion that agreements with the West are temporary, conditional, and ultimately unreliable. And once that belief is reinforced, the incentive structure shifts. If you're Iran, the logic becomes almost unavoidable. Without a deal, without economic relief, and under constant pressure, what leverage do you have left? The answer is capability, not necessarily building a nuclear weapon outright, but getting as close as possible. What analysts often call nuclear latency, the ability to cross the threshold quickly if needed. It's a form of strategic ambiguity, and it's powerful precisely because it creates uncertainty. Now shift the perspective to Israel. For Israeli leadership, the idea of a nuclear-capable Iran is not just a policy challenge, it's an existential one. This is a country that has built its entire security doctrine around preemption and deterrence. The memory of past threats isn't abstract, it's embedded in national consciousness. So when Israeli decision makers look at Iran's nuclear progress, they don't see a distant risk, they see a closing window, and that's where the timelines start to matter. In nuclear strategy, there's a concept known as breakout time, how long it would take a country to produce enough fissile material for a weapon. Under the nuclear deal, that timeline was extended, giving the international community space to respond. But as the deal unraveled and Iran advanced its enrichment capabilities, that timeline began to shrink. And when time shrinks, pressure expands. For the United States, the calculation is slightly different, but no less significant. Washington is not facing an existential threat in the same way Israel is, but it is facing a systemic one. A nuclear Iran doesn't just change the balance of power in the Middle East. It potentially triggers a cascade. Other regional actors begin to reconsider their own positions. The risk of proliferation increases, and suddenly what was once a contained issue becomes a global one. So you have three overlapping fears. Iran fears vulnerability and seeks leverage. Israel fears annihilation and seeks prevention. The United States fears instability and seeks control. None of these fears are irrational, but together they create a dynamic where every move by one side validates the concerns of the others. And here's where it becomes psychologically complex. Deterrence, the idea that nuclear weapons can prevent war, only works when all parties believe in rational restraint. But what happens when trust is absent, when intentions are unclear, when rhetoric is charged with ideology? In those conditions, deterrence starts to feel less like a safety net and more like a gamble. This is why, over time, the conversation shifts from diplomacy to inevitability, not because leaders necessarily want conflict, but because they begin to doubt that time is on their side. And in high stakes environments, uncertainty is often more dangerous than known risk. A delayed threat can feel more threatening than an immediate one because it leaves room for surprise. So the decision to act militarily is framed not as aggression, but as prevention, not as a first move, but as a last resort. The logic becomes, if we wait, the cost will be higher. If we act now, we retain control. It's a logic rooted not just in strategy, but in fear of losing agency. And yet there's a paradox at the heart of all this. The very actions taken to prevent a nuclear threat can accelerate the conditions that make it more likely. Pressure leads to resistance. Resistance leads to escalation. Escalation narrows the space for diplomacy, and the cycle continues. So when we talk about the nuclear question, we're not just talking about centrifuges and enrichment levels. We're talking about time, trust, and perception. We're talking about how states interpret each other's intentions in an environment where the stakes are absolute. Because in the end, nuclear conflict is rarely about the weapon itself. It's about the fear of what happens if you're the only one without it. And that's the uncomfortable truth. The pursuit of security, when driven by fear rather than trust, can become the very force that undermines it. The challenge then is not just to control the technology, but to confront the psychology behind it. Because without that, every agreement is temporary, every delay is fragile, and every crisis is only one miscalculation away from becoming irreversible. If identity defines the conflict and nuclear capability accelerates it, then the third layer, the one that makes it constant, lived, and unavoidable, is Iran's expanding regional influence. Because for years, this wasn't a war you could point to on a map. It was a war of presence, of positioning, of signals sent indirectly but understood very clearly by everyone involved. What Iran did, particularly over the past 2 decades, was refine a strategy that avoided direct confrontation while steadily increasing its reach. Instead of projecting power through conventional military dominance, it built relationships, networks, and alliances across the region, what is often referred to as the axis of resistance. And this includes groups and governments aligned with Tehran's interests, operating in places like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And at the center of this network is Hezbollah, arguably the most sophisticated and capable non-state actor in the Middle East. Now, from Iran's perspective, this strategy is not aggressive. It's defensive, surrounded by U.S. military bases, facing decades of sanctions and isolation. Tehran developed a model of asymmetric power. Instead of waiting for threats to reach its borders, it pushes its influence outward, creating depth. It's a form of strategic insurance. If conflict comes, it won't be contained within Iran. It will be distributed across the region. But from the perspective of Israel and the United States, this looks very different. It doesn't look like defense. It looks like encirclement. When Israel sees Hezbollah strengthening its missile capabilities in Lebanon or Iranian-backed forces gaining ground in Syria, it doesn't interpret that as distant maneuvering. It sees proximity. It sees pressure building at its borders, slowly but deliberately. This is where the idea of a shadow war becomes important. For years, the conflict between Israel and Iran played out in ways that were intentionally deniable: cyber attacks, targeted assassinations, airstrikes on weapons shipments, covert operations, actions that sent messages without triggering full-scale war. It was a kind of unspoken agreement. We will confront each other, but we will stop short of direct, open conflict. And for a while, that balance held, not because there was trust, but because there was clarity. Each side understood the limits. Each side believed the other preferred containment over escalation, but shadow wars have a tendency to expand. They accumulate. Each action invites a response, each response slightly more assertive than the last. Over time, the line between indirect and direct begins to blur. What was once a controlled rivalry starts to feel less predictable, less manageable. Take Syria, for example. What began as a civil war evolved into a strategic battleground. Iran increased its presence to support the government, embedding itself more deeply into the country's military and political infrastructure. Israel, in turn, intensified its air campaign, targeting what it viewed as Iranian entrenchment. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of an ongoing, escalating pattern. And this is where psychology re-enters the equation. Because at a certain point, it's not just about what the other side is doing, it's about what you believe they're trying to do. Intent becomes more important than action. And intent, unlike action, is much harder to verify. For Israel, the concern is not just that Iran has influence in neighboring countries. It's that this influence could be activated in a coordinated way during a larger conflict. Multiple fronts, multiple actors, all aligned against a single target. That's not just military challenge. It's a strategic nightmare. For the United States, the issue is broader but equally serious. Iran's regional network challenges American influence, undermines allies, and complicates efforts to stabilize the region. It creates a landscape where power is decentralized, where non-state actors play outsized roles, and where traditional deterrence becomes less effective. And for Iran, stepping back is not a simple option. These networks are not just tools of influence. They're extensions of its security doctrine. To dismantle them would be to reduce its own strategic depth, to become more exposed in a region it perceives as hostile. So you have a situation where all sides feel locked in. Iran cannot retreat without feeling vulnerable. Israel cannot tolerate expansion without feeling threatened. The United States cannot ignore the system without feeling weakened. And so the shadow war continues, but under increasing strain. Eventually, the question shifts. It's no longer about whether indirect conflict is sustainable. It's about whether it's still effective. If the shadow war no longer contains the threat, if it no longer deters escalation, then the logic begins to change. What was once a substitute for direct conflict starts to look like a prelude to it. And that's the turning point. When indirect confrontation loses its ability to manage risk, direct action begins to feel like the only remaining option, not because it's safer, but because it's clearer. It replaces ambiguity with decisiveness, even if that decisiveness carries its own dangers. So when the United States and Israel move from shadow operations to overt strikes, it's not a sudden shift. It's the result of a long erosion, an accumulation of pressure, perception, and strategic calculation that gradually closed off other paths. Because in the end, shadow wars rely on restraint, and restraint requires confidence that the other side shares your limits, your red lines, your desire to avoid catastrophe. The moment that confidence disappears, the shadows stop being a buffer. They become a warning. And that's the deeper lesson here. Conflicts don't escalate simply because of what actors do, but because of what they begin to believe. When every move is seen as preparation for something larger, the space for patience collapses. Or if we want to prevent future wars, we have to pay attention not just to actions, but to interpretations, because once the story each side tells itself becomes more powerful than the reality on the ground, escalation is no longer a choice. It becomes a conclusion. And then we arrive at the moment where all of these Langer forces, identity, nuclear anxiety, and regional competition, stop operating in the background and begin to converge, because wars are rarely the product of a single cause. They happen when multiple pressures align at the same time, narrowing the space for hesitation and making action feel not only possible, but necessary. By the time we reached the mid-2020s, diplomacy had not just stalled, it had lost credibility. The framework established by the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was no longer functioning as a stabilizing force. Attempts to revive it were caught in cycles of mistrust, domestic political constraints, and shifting regional dynamics. And when diplomacy becomes repetitive without producing results, it starts to feel less like a solution and more like delay. From Iran's perspective, the lesson was clear. Negotiation had limits, and those limits were defined by forces outside its control. Economic pressure persisted, political isolation remained, and security concerns intensified. So the country continued to invest in what it could control, its military capabilities, its technological progress, and its regional positioning, not necessarily as an act of aggression, but as a hedge against uncertainty. But here's where timing becomes critical, because strategy is not just about what you do, it's about when you do it. And for both the United States and Israel, the sense of timing was beginning to shift. The perception was that Iran was approaching a threshold technologically, militarily, and strategically, beyond which it would become far more difficult to contain. This is what analysts often describe as a closing window. It's the idea that there is a finite period during which action can still shape outcomes at an acceptable cost. Once that window closes, the risks don't disappear, they multiply. And in that environment, waiting starts to feel more dangerous than acting. At the same time, internal dynamics within Iran added another layer of complexity. Periods of domestic unrest, economic strain, and political tension created an image, fair or not, of a system under pressure. That, for external actors, this can be interpreted in two very different ways. One interpretation is caution. Instability makes a country more unpredictable, more reactive, and therefore more dangerous to confront. The other is opportunity. Instability makes a country more vulnerable, less capable of responding effectively, and therefore easier to challenge. Historically, states tend to lean toward the second interpretation, especially when combined with a sense of urgency. The logic becomes, if change is inevitable, better to influence it now than react to it later. And that logic can be incredibly persuasive, even if it's not entirely accurate. For Israel, this moment was shaped by a long-standing doctrine of preemption, the belief that waiting for threats to fully materialize is a risk in itself, that security is not preserved by reacting, but by anticipating. So when intelligence assessments suggest that an adversary is advancing toward a critical capability, the pressure to act increases, not gradually, but exponentially. For the United States, the calculation is broader but aligned. It's about maintaining credibility, not just in the Middle East, but globally. If red lines are drawn and not enforced, they begin to lose meaning. If adversaries believe that escalation will not be met with consequence, the entire structure of deterrence begins to weaken. So action in this context is not just about Iran, it's about the message it sends to others watching closely. And this is where coordination becomes important. When the United States and Israel act together or in close alignment, it amplifies both capability and signal. It suggests not just shared interests, but shared conclusions, that the situation has reached a point where inaction is no longer acceptable. But even at this stage, the decision to strike is not inevitable. It's a choice, one shaped by perception as much as by reality. Intelligence can be interpreted in different ways. Risks can be framed differently. Outcomes can be projected with varying degrees of confidence. What tips the balance is not just what is known, but what is believed. And belief in high stakes environments tends to gravitate toward worst case scenarios, like not because leaders are irrational, but because the cost of being wrong feels too high. If you overestimate a threat and act, you may face criticism or escalation. But if you underestimate it and do nothing, the consequences could be irreversible. So the decision becomes less about certainty and more about risk tolerance. How much uncertainty are you willing to live with? How much ambiguity can you accept? And at what point does the absence of clarity become a threat in itself? By the time strikes are launched, the narrative has already been constructed. It's not framed as the beginning of a conflict, but as the culmination of one, a response to years of buildup, missed opportunities, and narrowing al-khairat. And once that narrative takes hold, it becomes difficult to reverse, not just politically, but psychologically, because action creates its own momentum. It reshapes expectations, hardens positions, and reduces the space for allowda. What might have been a series of choices becomes a sequence of reactions. And in that environment, de-escalation requires not just strategy, but restraint, something that becomes harder to sustain with each passing khudwa. So when we look at the immediate triggers of this conflict, we shouldn't think of them as isolated events. They are the visible edge of a much deeper process, a convergence of timelines, perceptions, and decisions that together made conflict feel not just possible, but justified. And that's the final piece of the puzzle. Wars don't begin when leaders lose control. They begin when leaders believe they are still in control. But that control is slipping. The real question then is not why action was taken. It's why the alternatives no longer felt viable. Because if we want to understand how conflicts start, we have to look at how choices disappear, how options narrow, how over time the space between we could and we must quietly collapses. And if there's one thing worth reflecting on, it's this. The most dangerous moments in global politics are not when tensions are highest, but when imagination is lowest, when leaders can no longer see a path other than the one that leads to confrontation. That's the moment where history stops being shaped and starts repeating itself.